and it's chapter 2. Now, we don't panic in tight situations. That's part of our training. We're psychical investigation agents, and I can tell you it takes more than 15 visitors suddenly showing up to make us snap. Doesn't mean we don't get tetchy, though. One man, George, I said, sliding down the mound of earth and jumping over a mossy stone. You said one man was buried here, one bloke called Mallory. Care to point him out? Or do you find it hard to spot him in all this crowd? George scowled up from where he was checking his belt clips, adjusting the straps around each canister and flare. I went by historical account. You can't blame me. Oh, I could give it a good go. No one, Lockwood said, blames anyone. He had been standing very still. Narrowed eyes flickered around the glade. Making his decision, he swung into action. Plan F, he said. We follow Plan F right now. I looked at him. Is that the one where we run away? Not at all. It's the one that we beat a dignified emergency retreat. You're thinking of Plan G, Luce, George grunted. They're similar. Listen to me, Lockwood said. We can't stay in the circle all night. Besides, it may not hold. There are fewest visitors to the east. I can see 2 there. So that's the way we head. Sprint to that tall elm, then break through the woods, out across the common. If we go fast, they'll have trouble catching us. George and I still have our flares. If we get close to them, we use them. Sound good? It didn't exactly sound great, but it sure was better than any alternative I could see. I unclipped my salt bomb from my belt. George readied his flare. We waited for the word. The handless ghost that had wandered to the eastern side of the circle waited there. It had lost a lot of ectoplasm in its attempts to get past the iron, and was even more sorry-looking and pathetic than before. What is it with wraiths and their hideous appearance? Why don't they manifest as men or women that they once were? There were plenty of theories, but, as with so much about the ghostly epidemic, it bests us. No one knows the answer. That's why it's called the problem. Okay, Lockwood said. He stepped out of the circle. We threw the salt bomb at the ghost. It burst, salt erupting, blazing emerald as it connected with the plasm. The wraith fractured like a reflection in stirred water. Streams of pale light arched back from the salt and away from the circle, pulling at a distance to become a tattered form again. We didn't hang about to watch. We were already off and running across the black, uneven ground. Wet grass slapped against my legs. My rapier jolted in my hand. Pale forms moved among the trees, changing direction to pursue us. The nearest 2 drifted into the open, snapped necks jerking, heads lolling up towards the stars. They were fast, but we were faster. We were almost across the glade. The elm tree was straight ahead. Lockwood, having the longest legs, was some distance out in front. I was next, George on my heels. Another few seconds and would be in the darkest part of the woods, where no ghosts moved. It was going to be all right. I tripped. My foot caught. I went down hard. Grass crushed cold against my face. Dew splashed against my skin. Something struck my leg, and then George was sprawling over me, landing with a curse and rolling clear. I looked up. Lockwood, already at the tree, was turning. Only now did he realize we weren't with him. He gave a cry of warning, began to run back towards us. Cold air moved against me. I glanced to my side. A wraith stood there. Give it credit for originality. No skull or hollow sockets here, no stubs of bone. This one wore the shape of a corpse before it rotted. Its face was whole, the glazed eyes wide and gleaming. The skin was a dull white lustre, like those of a fish you see piled in the Covent Garden market stalls. The clarity was startling. I could see every last fibre of rope in the neck, the glints of moisture on the bright white teeth. And I was still on my front. I couldn't raise my sword or reach my belt. The visitor bent towards me, reaching out its faint white hand, and then it was gone. Searing brightness jetted out above me. A rain of salt and ash and burning iron pattered on my clothes and stung my face. The surge of the flare died back. I began to rise. "Thanks, George," I said. "Wasn't me." He pulled me up. "Look." The wood and glade were filled with moving lights, the narrow beams of white magnesium torches designed to cut through spectral flesh. Bustling forms charged through the undergrowth, solid, dark, and noisy. Boots crunched on twigs and leaves, and branches snapped as they were shoved aside. Muttered commands were given, sharp replies sounded, alert and keen and watchful. The wraith's advance was broken. As if bewildered, they flitted purposelessly in all directions. Salt flared. Explosions of Greek fire burst among the trees. Nets of silhouetted branches blazed briefly, burned bright against my retinas. One after the other, the wraiths were speedily cut down. Lockwood had reached us now. Like George and me, he stopped in shock at this sudden interruption. As we watched, figures broke free into the glade and marched over the grass towards us. In the glow of the torches and explosions, the rapiers and jackets shone in an unnatural silver, perfect and pristine. "Fitz agents," I said. "Oh, great," George growled. "I think I would have preferred the wraiths." It was far worse than we thought. It wasn't any old bunch of Fitch agents. That was Kip's team. Not that we discovered this immediately, since for the first 10 seconds the newcomers insisted on shining their torches directly in our faces, so we were rendered blind. At last they lowered their beams, and by a combination of feral chuckling and their foul deodorant, we realized who it was. "Tony Lockwood," said an unamused voice, "with George Cubbins and, uh, is it Julie? Sorry, I can never remember the girl's name. What on earth are you playing at here?" Someone switched on a night lantern, which is softer than the mag torches, and everyone's faces was illuminated. There were 3 of them standing next to us. Other grey-jacketed agents moved to and fro across the glade, scattering salt and iron. Silvery smoke hung between the trees. "You do look a sight," Quill Kipps said. Have I mentioned Kipps before? He's a team leader of the Fitz Agency London division. Fitz, of course, is the oldest and most prestigious psychical investigation agency in the country. It was more than 300 operatives working from a massive office on the Strand. Most of its operatives were under 16, some were as young as 8. They're grouped into teams, which is led by an adult supervisor. Quill Kipps is one of those. Being diplomatic, I'd say Kipps was a slightly built young man in his early 20s with close-cut reddish hair and a narrow, freckled face. Being undiplomatic, but more precise, I'd say he's a pint-sized, pug-nosed, carrot-topped inadequate with a chip on his shoulder the size of Big Ben, a sneer on a sneer on legs, a malevolent buffoon. He's too old to be any good with ghosts, but that doesn't stop him wearing the biggest or blingiest rapier you will ever see, weighed down to the pommel with cheap paste jewels. Anyway, where was I? Kipps. He loathes Lockwood Co. Big time. "You do look a sight," Kipps said again, even scruffier than usual. I realized then that all 3 of us had been caught in the blast of the flare. The front of Lockwood's clothes was singed, and his face laced with stripes of burned salt. Black dust fell from my coat and leggings as I moved. My hair was disordered, and there was a faint smell of burning leather coming from my boots. George was sooty too, but otherwise less affected, perhaps because of the thick coat of mud all over him. Lockwood spoke casually, brushing the ash off his shirt cuffs. "Thanks for the help, Kipps," he said. "We were in a tightish spot there, but we still had it under control." He took a deep breath. "That flare came in handy." Kipps grinned. "Don't mention it. We just saw 3 clueless locals running for their lives. Cat here had to throw the first one and ask questions later. We never guessed the idiots were you. The girl beside him smiled. Or rather, the girl beside him said unsmilingly, "They've completely botched this operation. There's no way I can listen here. Too much psychic noise." "Well, we're clearly close to the source," Kip said. "It should be easy to find. Perhaps Lockwood's team can help us now." "Doubt it," the girl said, shrugging. Kat Godwin, Kip's right-hand operative, was a listener like me, but that was about all we had in common. She was blonde, slim, pouty, which had given me 3 reasons to dislike her, even if she'd been a sweet lass who had spent her free time tending to pearly hedgehogs. In fact, she was a flinty, ambitious, and cool-natured person, and had less capacity for humour than a terrapin. Jokes made her irritable, as if she sensed something going on around her that she couldn't understand. She was good-looking, though her jaw was a bit too sharp, as if she'd fallen repeatedly over, or if she'd fallen over repeatedly while crossing soft ground. You, right. The sentence is actually, if she'd repeatedly fallen over while crossing soft ground, you could have sown a crop of beans in the chin holes she'd left behind. The back of her hair was cut short, but the front hung angled across her brow in the manner of a horse's flick. Her grey Fitz jacket, skirt, and leggings were always spotless, which made me doubt that she'd ever had to climb up a chimney to escape a spectre or battle a poltergeist in the Bridewell sewers. Officially the worst job ever, as I had. Annoyingly, I always seemed to meet her precisely after that kind of incident, like now. "What are you hunting tonight?" Lockwood asked. Unlike George and me, both wrapped in sullen silence, he was doing his best to be polite. The source is this, the source of this cluster hunting," Kip said. He gestured at the trees, where the last visitor had just evaporated into a burst of emerald light. "It's quite a major operation." Lockwood glanced at the lines of child agents streaming across the glade. They carried salt guns, hand catapults, and flare throwers. Apprentices loped along with chain reels snapped to their backs. Others dragged portable arc lamps and tea urns and wheeled caskets containing silver seals. "So I see," he said. "You're sure you've quite enough protection?" "Unlike you," Kip said, "we knew what we were getting into." He cast his eyes over the meagre contents of our belts. "How you thought you'd survive a host of wraiths with that little lot, I don't know. Yes, Gladys?" The pig-tailed girl, maybe 8 years old, had scampered up. She saluted smartly. "Please, Mr. Kipps, we found a possible psychic nexus in the middle of the glade. There's a pile of earth and a big hole." "I'll have to stop you there," Lockwood said. "That's where we're working. In fact, this whole thing is our assignment. The mayor of Wimbledon gave us this job 2 days ago." Kipps raised a ginger eyebrow. "Sorry, Tony, he's given it to us too. It's an open commission. Anyone can take it, and whoever finds the source first gets the money." "Well then, that'll be us," George said stonily. He cleaned his glasses, but the rest of his face was still brown with mud. He looked like some kind of owl. "If you've found it," Cat Godwin said, "how come you haven't sealed it? Why are all these ghosts running around?" This, despite her chin and hairstyle, was a fair point. "We found the burial spot," Lockwood said. "We're just digging for the remains now." There was a silence. "Burial spot?" Kip said. Lockwood hesitated. "Obviously. That's where all these criminals were put." He looked at them. The blonde girl laughed. "Imagine an upper-class horse neighing contemptuously from a sunbed at 3 passing donkeys, and you have her down perfectly." "You're a total bunch of absolute duffers," Kip said. "That's rich," Cat Godwin snorted. That's priceless. Meaning what? Lockwood said stiffly. Kip swiped his eye with a finger. Meaning this clearing isn't a burial site, you idiots. It's an execution ground. It's where the gallows stood. Hold on. He turned and called out across the glade. Hey, Bobby, over here. Yes, sir, Mr. Kip, sir. A tiny figure trotted over from the centre of the glade, where he'd been supervising operations. I groaned inwardly. Bobby Vernon. He was the newest and most annoying Kip's agents. He'd only been with him a month or two. Vernon was short and possibly also very young, although there was something oddly middle-aged about him, so I wouldn't have been surprised if he was secretly turned out to have been a 52-year-old man. Even compared to his leader, who was diminutive, Vernon was small. Standing next to Kip's, his head came up to his shoulders. Standing next to Godwin, he came up to her chest. When he came up to Lockwood, I dreaded to think, or where he came up to on Lockwood, I dreaded to think. Unfortunately, I never saw them close together. He wore short grey trousers, from which tiny legs, like hairy bamboo canes, protruded. His feet were almost non-existent. His face shone pale, with featureless beneath a swirl of brill-creamed hair. Vernon was clever. Like George, he specialised in research. Tonight he carried a small clipboard with a penlight attached to it, and by its glow surveyed a map of the Wimbledon Common encased in a weatherproof sleeve. Kip said, Our friends seem a bit confused about the nature of this site, Bobby. I was just telling them about the gallows. Care to fill them in? Vernon wore a smirk, so self-satisfied it practically circled his head and hugged itself. Certainly, sir. I took the trouble to visit Wimbledon Library, he said, looking into the history of local crime, where I discovered an account of a man called Mallory who was hung and buried on the common. George snapped. Exactly what I found too. Ah, but did you also visit the library at Wimbledon All Saints Church? Vernon said. I found something interesting uh, in the local chronicle there. It turns out Mallory's remains were rediscovered when the road was widened at the crossroads, 1824, I think it was. They were removed and interred elsewhere. So it's not his bones that the ghost is tied to, but the place he died. And the same goes for all these other people executed on this spot. Mallory was just the first, you see. The Chronicle listed dozens more victims over the years, all strung up by the gallows here. Vernon tapped his clipboard and simpered at us. That's it, really. The records are easy enough to find, if you know the right place. Lockwood glanced sidelong at George, who said nothing. The gallows itself is, of course, long gone, Vernon went on. So what we're after is probably some kind of post or prominent stone that marks where the gallows once stood. In all likelihood, this is the source that controls all the ghosts that we've seen. Well, Tony, Kipps demanded, any you seen this stone? There was one, Lockwood said reluctantly, in the centre of the glade. Bobby Vernon clicked his tongue. Ah, good. Don't tell me. Squared, slanting to one side with a wide, deep groove, just like so. None of us had bothered to study the mossy stone. Uh, might have been. Yes, that's the gallows mark, where the wooden post was driven. It was the grove that the stone had that, that buried the executed bodies would have swung until they fell apart. He blinked at us. Don't tell me you disturbed it at all. No, no, Lockwood said. We left it well alone. There was a shout from one of the agents in the centre of the hollow. Found a squared stone. Obvious gallow marks. Looks like someone's just dug it up and chucked it over here. Lockwood winced. Vernon gave a complacent laugh. Oh dear, sounds like you uprooted the prime source for the cluster and then ignored it. No wonder so many visitors began to return. It's a bit like leaving on a tap when filling the sink. It soon gets messy. Well, I'll just go and supervise the sealing of the important relic. Nice talking to you. He skipped off across the grass. We watched him with dark eyes. Talented fellow, that, Kipps remarked. Bet you wish you had him. Lockwood shook his head. No, I'd always be tripping over him or losing him down the back of the sofa. Now, Quill, since we've clearly found the source and your agents are sealing it, it's obvious we should share the commission. I propose a 60-40 split in our favour. Shall we both visit the mayor tomorrow and make that suggestion? Kipps and Godwin laughed, not very kindly. Kipps patted Lockwood on the shoulder. Tony, Tony, I'd love to help, but you know perfectly well it's only agents who actually seal the source that get the fee. DPRAC rules, I'm afraid. Lockwood stepped back and put his hand to the hilt of his rapier. You're taking the source? We are. I can't allow that. I'm afraid you haven't any choice. Kipps gave a whistle, and four enormous operatives, each one clearly a close cousin of a mountain ape, stalked out of the darkness, rapiers drawn. They arranged themselves beside him. Lockwood slowly took his hand away from his belt. George and I, who had been about to draw our weapons, subsided too. That's better, Quill Kipps said. Face it, Tony, you're not really a proper agency at all. 3 agents? Scarcely a single flare to call your own. You're a flea-pitched shambles. You can't even afford a uniform. Any time you come up with a real organisation, you'll end up a sorry second best. Now, do you think you could find your way back across the common, or shall I send Gladys here to hold your hand? With a supreme effort, Lockwood regained his composure. Thank you. No escort will be necessary, he said. George, Lucy, come on. I was already walking, but George, eyes flashing behind his round discs of spectacles, didn't move. George? Lockwood repeated. Yeah, but this is the Fitz agency overall, or all over. George muttered. They're just because they're bigger and more powerful, they think they can strong arm anyone who stands in their way. Well, I'm sick of it. If this was a level playing field, we'd have thrashed them. I know we would, Lockwood said softly, but it isn't. Let's go. Kipps chuckled. Sounds like sour grapes to me, Cubbins. That's not like you. I'm surprised you can hear me behind your wall of hired flunkies, Kipps, George said. You just keep yourself safe there. Maybe one day we'll have a fair contest with you. We'll see who wins then. He turned to go. Is that a challenge? Kipps called. George, Lockwood said. Come on. No, no, Tony. Kipps pushed his way past his agents. He was grinning. I like the sound of this. Cubbins, pardon me. Cubbins has had a decent idea for once in his life. A contest. You lot against the pick of my team. This might be quite amusing. What do you say, Tony? Or does the idea alarm you? Hasn't struck me before, but when Kipps smiled, he rather mirrored Lockwood, a smaller, showier, more aggressive version, a spotted hyena to Lockwood's wolf. Lockwood wasn't smiling now. He'd drawn himself up, facing Kipps. His eyes glittered. Oh, I like the idea well enough, he said. George is right. In a fair fight we'd beat you hands down. There'd be no strong arming, no funny business. Just a test of all agency disciplines, research the range of talents, ghost suppression and removal. But what are the stakes? There need to be something riding on it, something that makes it worth our while. Kipps nodded. True. And there's nothing that you've got that I could possibly want. Well, I actually disagree. Lockwood smoothed down his coat. What about this? If we ever get a joint case again, the team that solves it wins the day. The loser then places an advert in the Times, publicly admitting defeat and declaring the other team is infinitely superior to his own. How's that? You find that highly amusing, wouldn't you, Kipps? If you won. He raised an eyebrow at his rival, who hadn't answered immediately. Of course you're nervous and all. Nervous? Kipps snorted. Not likely. It's a deal. Cat and Julie are witness to it. If our paths cross again, we'll go head to head. Meanwhile, Tony, do try to keep your team alive. He walked away. Cat Godwin and the others followed him across the glade. Uh, my name's Lucy, I said. No one heard me. They had work to do. In the glow of arc lights, agents under Bobby Vernon's direction were placing silver chain nets over mossy stone. Others pulled the trolley over the grass, ready to carry it away. Cheers sounded, also clapping and sporadic laughter. It was another triumph for the Fitz agency, another case stolen from under the noses of Lockwood Co. Three of us stood silently in the darkness for a time. I had to speak out, George said. Sorry. It was either that or punch him. I've got sensitive hands. No need to apologise, Lockwood said. If we can't beat Kip's gang in a fair fight, I declared heartily, we may as well give up now. Right. George clapped his fist into his palm. Bits of mud dropped away from him onto the grass. We're the best agents in London, aren't we? Exactly, Lockwood said. None better. Now, Lucy's shirt front's rather burned, and I think my trousers are disintegrating. How about we get off home? And that's the end of part one for it. We'll begin part two in a few weeks' time. And sorry my voice has been going. I have a cold again. Or I think it's COVID. I've lost my taste. But anyway, thank you for listening.